In the busy hallways of Maplewood High, there was a girl who always seemed to fade into the background. She wasn't loud or flashy. She didn't hang out with big groups of friends or try to grab anyone's attention. This girl preferred books. Over parties, quiet corners over crowded cafeterias, and keeping her head down when things got rowdy. To most people, she was invisible, just another face in the sea of students rushing between classes. But invisibility has its downsides. For this girl, staying under the radar meant becoming an easy target for those looking to stir up trouble. And trouble had a name at Maplewood High: Jocks Monroe. Jocks was one of those kids everyone noticed, whether they liked it or not. He was tall, confident, and had a group of followers who laughed at all his jokes, even the mean ones. They weren't just friends. They were more like a pack, moving together through the school like they owned the place. Jocks and his crew thrived on making others feel small. Whether it was mocking someone for their clothes, tripping them in the hallway, or stealing snacks. From lunch bags, they found joy in other people's misery. They weren't picky about who they targeted either. It could be anyone, really. But lately, their favorite victim was the quiet girl no one paid much attention to. Maybe it was because she never fought back. Or maybe it was because she seemed so harmless. Whatever the reason, she became their go-to source of entertainment. One afternoon, after the final bell rang, the girl decided to take a break from everything. She walked outside to the picnic tables near the soccer field, where fewer people hung around. It was peaceful there, away from the noise and chaos of the school building. Sitting alone, she pulled out a small stack of colorful paper and started folding it into intricate shapes. Origami was her escape, a hobby she'd learned from her late grandmother. Each fold brought back memories of sitting beside her as a child, watching her hands move with precision and care. The act of creating something beautiful out of something simple gave her comfort, especially on days when life felt overwhelming. As she worked, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For a few moments, she forgot about the world around her. That is, until a shadow fell over her table. Looking up, she saw Jocks and his crew standing there, smirking down at her. "What do we have here?" Jocks said, picking up one of the delicate paper cranes she just finished. Before she could stop him, he crumpled it in his fist and tossed it aside. His friends laughed, egging him on as he grabbed another piece and tore it straight down the middle. "Leave me alone," she said quietly, trying to sound firm but failing. Her voice barely carried over the sound of their laughter. Instead of backing off, they only grew bolder. One of them snatched her math homework right out of her bag, holding it high above her head while she reached for it in vain. Then, without warning, they ripped it to shreds, scattering the pieces like confetti before walking away, leaving her humiliated and defeated. She sat there for a long time, staring at the torn remains of her work. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying wouldn't fix anything, it never did. What was the point of fighting back? She was outnumbered, outmatched, and too tired to keep trying. But deep inside, something stirred. A spark of anger flared to life, burning brighter than it ever had before. Enough was enough. She couldn't let them win anymore. She needed to stand up for herself, but how? That night, lying awake in bed, she replayed the scene over and over in her mind. How could she possibly fight back against someone like Jocks? He was bigger, stronger, and surrounded by his loyal followers. She wasn't athletic or tough. She didn't know how to throw a punch or intimidate anyone. But then she thought about her origami, the delicate art that had been mocked and destroyed earlier that day. Could it be more than just a hobby? Could it become her weapon? With determination lighting her way, she climbed into the attic and began searching through old boxes. Buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten treasures, she found a leather-bound journal that once belonged to her grandmother. Flipping through its pages, she discovered sketches, notes, and instructions for advanced origami techniques. Toward the back, she stumbled upon a section titled Origami Combat. At first, she thought it was a joke, a playful idea her grandmother might have dreamed up. But as she read further, she realized it was real. Specific folds and creases could turn ordinary paper into objects of surprising strength and sharpness. Her heart raced as she imagined what she could do with this knowledge. If she practiced hard enough, maybe she could create something powerful enough to protect herself. Maybe she could finally show Jocks and his crew that she wasn't someone to mess with. With renewed energy, she stayed up late into the night, experimenting with different shapes and designs. By morning, her fingers were sore and her room was littered with scraps of paper. But she had created something incredible, a tiny origami star that gleamed like a blade in the sunlight, for the first time. In weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. The bullies may have thought they'd broken her, but they had no idea what was coming next. The moment she stepped into school on Friday morning, the air felt different. It wasn't just her, everyone seemed to sense that something was about to happen. Word had spread quickly after the incident outside, and whispers followed her as she made her way down the crowded hallways. Some students stared at her with curiosity, others with pity, but none of them dared to say anything directly. Even the teachers cast sideways glances in her direction, unsure of what to expect. But she didn't care about their stares or their gossip. She had one goal: to face Jocks and his crew head on. This time, she wouldn't be the quiet girl who let them tear her apart. She carried herself differently now, walking taller, holding her head up high. Her backpack felt heavier than usual, not because of books or notebooks, but because of the carefully folded origami weapons tucked inside. Each step brought her closer to the confrontation she knew was inevitable. It didn't take long for it to happen. As she stood by her locker during break, trying to focus on organizing her things, she heard the familiar sound of laughter echoing down the hallway. Turning slowly, she saw Jax and his group approaching, their confidence radiating off them like heat. They moved like they owned the place, shoving past other students without a second thought. When they reached her, Jax leaned casually against the locker next to hers, smirking. Well, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Look who decided to show up today. Thought you might have stayed home after what happened. She froze for a split second, her fingers gripping the edge of her locker door tightly. But then she forced herself to relax. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face him, meeting his gaze steadily. Gone was the timid expression he was used to seeing. In its place was calm determination. What do you want? She asked, her voice firm despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. Jocks raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her tone. He glanced at his friends, who exchanged confused looks before bursting into laughter. What do I want? He repeated, feigning innocence. I don't know. Maybe another piece of your little art project. Or maybe we should see if you've got any more homework lying around. His words sent a ripple of unease through the crowd that had gathered nearby. Everyone expected her to shrink back, to apologize or beg him to leave her alone. That's what she always did, but not this time. Instead, she reached into her backpack and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The crowd fell silent as they watched her unfold it and begin shaping it with quick, precise movements. At first, Jocks looked amused, crossing his arms and leaning forward slightly. What's this? He sneered. Another bird? You gonna try to fly away from me? She ignored him, focusing entirely on her task. Within seconds, the flat sheet of paper transformed into a small, sharp-edged star. Holding it between two fingers, she flicked her wrist, sending it slicing through the air. There was a collective gasp as the star embedded itself into the metal frame of the locker just inches from Jax's ear. His smirk vanished instantly, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Before he could react, she reached into her bag again, pulling out a second piece of paper. With practiced ease, she unfolded it into a long, thin blade. Stepping forward, she held it up so he could see it clearly. "You want my homework?" she said, her voice steady and cold. "Here's your chance to back off or find out what happens when I actually use this." For a moment, no one moved. Jock stared at her, his face pale, while his friend shuffled awkwardly behind him. Then, unable to resist the bravado that defined him, he lunged forward, swinging wildly. But she was ready. Sidestepping his clumsy attack, she whipped out another creation, a coiled strip of reinforced paper that unfurled into a whip-like weapon. With a sharp crack, she snapped it across his arm, forcing him to stumble backward. Before he could recover, she pressed her advantage, using the whip to keep him at bay while simultaneously folding another star with her free hand. The fight, if you could even call it, that lasted less than a minute. Jax, unprepared for her speed and precision, found himself completely outmatched. Every move he made was countered effortlessly. Every attempt to intimidate her met with calm, calculated resistance. Finally, with one last flick of her wrist, she sent another star flying, pinning the sleeve of his jacket to the locker behind him. Trapped and humiliated, he yanked himself free, breathing hard and glaring at her with pure hatred. The hallway was deathly silent. Students who had once feared Jax now looked at the girl with awe and disbelief. No one had ever stood up to him like that before, and certainly not someone who had been written off as weak and insignificant. For the first time in years, Jax Monroe was at a loss for words. Without saying another word, he turned and stormed off, his friends scrambling to follow him. As the crowd dispersed, murmurs of admiration spread throughout the school. The girl didn't stick around to hear them. She packed up her things, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline rush, and walked away. She hadn't done it for recognition or applause. She'd done it because she couldn't let fear control her life anymore. And though she didn't realize it yet, that single act of courage would change everything for her and for everyone else at Maplewood High. The days that followed the showdown in the hallway were unlike anything the school had ever seen. News of what happened spread like wildfire, and it wasn't just gossip, it was awe. Students who had once whispered behind her back now looked at her with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Teachers, too, seemed to view her differently. Some gave her knowing smiles in the hallways, while others nodded approvingly when she answered questions in class. Even the cafeteria staff greeted her warmly, as if they'd always known she had something special about her. But for her, life didn't change overnight. At first, she kept waiting for the other shoe to drop for Jax and his crew to come back, with revenge or for someone to expose her secret. After all, she hadn't used brute strength or loud threats to stand up to them. She'd relied on something far more unusual: origami. The idea that paper could be turned into weapons felt surreal, even to her. What if people found out? Would they call her weird? Or worse, would they demand she demonstrate her skills again? To her surprise, no one asked questions. Instead, the incident became a kind of legend. Rumors swirled about how she'd folded Jax in half, though no one knew exactly what that meant. Some kids claimed she'd used magic. Others said she was secretly trained in martial arts. The truth that she'd spent hours perfecting folds and creases in her grandmother's journal was so ordinary that no one even considered it. And maybe that was for the best. Letting people believe in something extraordinary made her feel safer, like she still had control over her secret. As the weeks went by, she noticed subtle changes in the school. For one, Jax and his crew weren't as loud or aggressive as they used to be. They still hung out together, but their swagger was gone. Jocks avoided eye contact whenever he passed her in the hallway, and his friends stopped picking on younger students. It was almost as if her actions had sent a ripple effect through the entire school, a reminder that standing up to bullies wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about showing others that bullying didn't have to be tolerated. Seeing this shift inspired her to do more. She realized that her newfound confidence wasn't just for herself, it could help others too. So she started small. During lunch breaks, she began teaching younger students how to fold simple origami shapes. Cranes, frogs, and flowers became her tools for connection. At first, only a handful of kids showed interest, but soon word got around and more joined in. Before long, she had a little group gathered around her every day, laughing and creating together. She didn't talk much about what had happened with Jocks, but she did share pieces of her story when it felt right. One afternoon, as she helped a shy girl fold a paper butterfly, she mentioned how origami had taught her patience and focus. "It's not just about making pretty things," she explained. "It's about finding beauty in hard work. Sometimes, when life feels messy, folding paper helps me organize my thoughts." The girl looked up at her, wide-eyed. "Do you think I can learn to make stronger stuff?" she asked hesitantly. She smiled. "Stronger stuff?" "You know," the girl said, lowering her voice, "like what you did to Jax." Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone to bring that up directly. But instead of brushing it off, she decided to be honest. "Origami isn't about fighting," she said gently. "It's about creativity and problem solving. If you want to stand up for yourself, you don't need fancy tricks. You just need courage and sometimes a little help from your friends." That conversation stuck with her. It made her realize that kids needed guidance, not just in standing up to bullies, but in understanding why kindness mattered. With permission from her teachers, she organized an anti-bullying workshop during the school's activity week. She called it Folding Kindness. The title sounded cheesy, but it worked. Dozens of students signed up, eager to learn more about the quiet girl who had taken down Jocks Monroe. On the day of the workshop, she stood in front of the room holding a single sheet of paper. "Origami is more than just art," she began. "It's about transformation. You take something flat and turn it into something three-dimensional, something meaningful. In the same way, we can transform our attitudes and actions to make the world around us better." She demonstrated basic folds, encouraging everyone to try. As the students worked, she shared stories about her grandmother, about the power of persistence, and about how standing up for yourself doesn't mean tearing others down. By the end of the session, the room was filled with laughter and chatter. Kids proudly held up their creations, comparing cranes and stars. One boy even declared, "I'm gonna fold 1,000 cranes and give them to my little sister." Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Teachers praised her initiative, and parents wrote letters thanking her for inspiring their children. Even the principal invited her to speak at the next school assembly. Though public speaking terrified her, she agreed. Standing on stage in front of the entire school, she held up a beautifully folded crane and spoke from the heart. "This crane represents resilience," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Just like paper, we're all fragile in some ways, but with care and effort, we can become strong. We can rise above challenges and create something beautiful." My hope is that each of you will find your own way to stand tall, to support one another, and to make kindness as natural as breathing. When she finished, the auditorium erupted into applause. Students cheered, clapping so loudly that her ears rang. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not as the quiet girl who blended into the background, but as someone who had made a difference. Even Jax approached her after the assembly. He didn't apologize right away. Instead, he mumbled, Something about needing extra credit for a class project. Sensing an opportunity, she offered to teach him some basic origami folds. To her surprise, he accepted. Over the next few weeks, they met occasionally in the library, where she patiently showed him how to shape paper into simple objects. Their conversations were awkward at first, but gradually they found common ground. Jacques admitted that he'd been bullied himself when he was younger, which had driven him to act tough and lash out at others. Hearing this softened her anger toward him, replacing it with empathy. By the end of the school year, the atmosphere at Maplewood High had transformed. Bullies still existed, of course they always would, but the culture of fear had faded. Students stood up for themselves and each other, and acts of kindness became contagious. And though she never revealed the full extent of her origami combat skills, the legend of the girl who folded her bully in half lived on, inspiring countless others to face their fears with courage and grace. As graduation day approached, the girl found herself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past year. Maplewood High wasn't the same place it had been when she first walked through its doors as a nervous freshman. Back then, she'd been invisible, just another face in the crowd trying to stay out of trouble. But now she was someone people looked up to. Not because she was loud or flashy, but because she'd shown them what courage looked like. The school's hallways no longer felt suffocating. Where there used to be tension and fear, there was laughter and connection. Students who had once cowered under Jax's shadow now stood tall, unafraid to speak their minds. Even the teachers seemed lighter, less burdened by constant discipline. Issues. The change wasn't perfect. It never could be, but it was real. And she knew she'd played a part in making it happen. On the morning of graduation, she woke up early, unable to sleep. Her room was filled with reminders of how far she'd come. Stacks of colorful paper, half-finished origami projects, and her grandmother's worn journal lying open on her desk. She ran her fingers over its pages, tracing the diagrams and notes that had taught her so much more than just folding techniques. They'd taught her resilience, creativity, and the importance of standing up for herself and others. Dressed in her cap and gown, she joined her classmates outside the auditorium, where rows of chairs stretched across the football field. Balloons swayed gently in the breeze, and banners congratulating the graduating class fluttered overhead. Parents snapped photos, while younger siblings chased each other around the edges of the ceremony. It was chaotic, but beautiful, a celebration of growth and new beginnings. When her name was called during the ceremony, she stepped onto the stage to receive her diploma. As she shook hands with the principal, the crowd erupted into applause, not just polite clapping, but genuine cheers. She scanned the faces in the audience, spotting her parents beaming proudly from the front row. Nearby, some of the students she taught origami to waved enthusiastically, holding up cranes they'd folded especially for the occasion. For a moment, she felt overwhelmed, tears welling up in her eyes. This wasn't just her victory, it belonged to everyone who had chosen kindness over cruelty, strength over fear. After the ceremony ended, she lingered on the field, taking it all in. Friends hugged her, thanking her for inspiring them to believe in themselves. Even Jax approached her one last time, this time without hesitation or awkwardness. "I owe you," he said simply, extending his hand. She shook it, nodding. There was no need for long speeches. They both understood how far they'd come since that day in the hallway. That night, surrounded by family and close friends at a small party, she opened her grandmother's journal once more. Flipping through its pages, she realized something important. Her journey wasn't ending here. Origami had given her so much more than a way to defend herself. It had become her purpose. She wanted to share it with the world, to teach others how art could transform lives in ways big and small. The next few years, she traveled to schools, community centers, and workshops across the country. Armed with nothing more than sheets of paper and her grandmother's teachings, she showed people of all ages how to fold their fears into cranes, their anger into stars, and their hopes into flowers. Her message was simple. Everyone has the power to create something beautiful, even in the toughest moments. She also wrote a book, a combination of her grandmother's techniques and her own experiences. Titled Folding Courage, it became a bestseller, inspiring readers worldwide. Some were drawn to the practical tips for crafting intricate designs. Others connected with her story of overcoming adversity. Through interviews, talks, and social media, she continued spreading her message of resilience and kindness. But perhaps her proudest achievement came years later, when she returned to Maplewood High as a guest speaker. Walking through the familiar hallways, she saw posters promoting anti-bullying campaigns and bulletin boards covered in origami creations made by current students. Teachers greeted her warmly, telling her how much things had improved since she graduated. And when she stood on stage again, addressing a new generation of teenagers, she held up a single crane. "This is more than just paper," she said, her voice steady and warm. "It's proof that we can rise above challenges, that we can turn something fragile into something strong. Never underestimate the power of your own hands or your heart." As she left the school that evening, she paused to watch the sunset. Just like she used to do during those quiet afternoons folding paper outside. Life had taken her farther than she ever imagined, but she still carried the lessons she'd learned at Maplewood High. Origami wasn't just an art form, it was a reminder that transformation was possible, whether you were folding paper or shaping your future. And as she walked away, clutching her grandmother's journal tightly in her arms, she smiled. The girl who had once been invisible had become unforgettable, not because of what she'd done, but because of who she'd inspired to follow in her footsteps. The night after the incident, sleep didn't come easy. The girl lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of what had happened outside the school. The laughter, the crumpled paper crane, the ripped homework, it all felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. But this time, something was different. Instead of feeling defeated, she felt a strange kind of fire burning inside her. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was plenty of that. It was more like determination, a quiet but unshakable resolve to change things. She couldn't let them push her around anymore. She couldn't sit back and let them destroy the things she cared about without consequences. But how? How could someone like her stand up to someone like Jax? He was bigger, louder, and always surrounded by his crew. She wasn't strong or intimidating. She wasn't even particularly brave. What could she possibly do? That's when she remembered the journal. It had been years since she'd thought about it. Her grandmother had left it behind, along with so many other treasures packed away in dusty boxes in the attic. The journal was filled with notes, sketches, and instructions for origami techniques, things far more complex than the simple shapes she usually folded. At the time, she'd only skimmed through it, too young to fully understand most of it. But now, as she climbed up into the attic and pulled the journal from its hiding place, she realized it might hold the answers she needed. Sitting cross-legged on the attic floor, she flipped through the pages by the dim light of an old lamp. Each page revealed something new. Diagrams for folding intricate animals, flowers, and geometric patterns. Some of them looked impossible, like they required superhuman precision. But then she reached a section near the back labeled Origami Combat. At first, she thought it was some kind of joke, a whimsical idea her grandmother had scribbled down for fun. But as she read further, her heart began to race. This wasn't just playful imagination. It was real. There were detailed instructions for turning paper into functional tools, sharp-edged stars, razor-thin blades, even flexible whips. According to the notes, certain folds and creases could make ordinary paper incredibly strong and durable. It sounded unbelievable, but she trusted her grandmother completely. If anyone could figure out how to turn art into strength, it was her. Determined to see if it would work, the girl gathered supplies and got to work. She started with the simplest design, a small star-shaped object. Following the instructions, carefully, she folded and pressed the paper until it held its shape perfectly. When she was done, she held it up to the light. It looked harmless enough, like a decoration you might hang on a Christmas tree. But when she tested its edge against a piece of cardboard, she gasped. The star sliced right through it, leaving a clean cut behind. Her hands trembled as she stared at the tiny object. Was this really possible? Could something as fragile as paper become strong enough to defend herself? She tried another design next to thin blade and found that it worked just as well. By the time the sun began to rise, her room was littered with scraps of paper and half-finished creations. But she had also assembled a small collection of origami weapons, stars, blades, and even a whip-like strip that coiled tightly when folded correctly. Each item gave her a little more confidence. For so long she'd felt powerless, like the world was against her and there was nothing she could do about it. But now, holding these delicate yet surprisingly sturdy objects in her hands, she began to feel something else, hope. Maybe she wasn't as weak as she thought. Maybe she could fight back not with fists or shouting, but with skill and creativity. Over the next few days, she practiced relentlessly. She learned how to fold faster, how to aim accurately, and how to carry her creations discreetly in her backpack. She experimented with different types of paper, discovering which ones were strongest and most durable. She even figured out how to reinforce the folds with subtle layers of tape, making the objects even tougher without adding bulk. By the time Friday rolled around, she was ready. Walking into school that morning, she felt a strange mix.